My name is Claire Huschel. I am the Director of the Arts Management Program at George Mason University. And today's panel is part of a program that we have. It's essentially a networking and professional development series that we run in our program for our students and our alumni. And it deals with sort of pressing issues in the performing and visual arts world. And today's panel presentation is about running artist-centric arts organizations, which sounds sort of strange because it seems like an arts organization should automatically be artist-centric. But I realized after going to a conference in the fall at Common Field, have any of you heard of Common Field? Do you know something about? And Hand in Glove is the actual name of the convening. And that is really the Common Field. If you haven't heard of it, look it up because it's a really fantastic organization. And it is a group of artist-led initiatives that get together once a year to talk about how to make it in the world as sort of leading artist-centric projects. And it got me thinking about how in a world where artists are less and less likely to be working in traditional modes, in other words, less and less likely to be simply represented by a gallery or looking for that next, earlier mid-career museum show, how can arts managers, my students, be trained to help artists with the sort of the newer initiatives, things like social practice art or DIY pop-up projects, or installation or participatory art. And I thought that would make a really interesting topic of conversation. So that's what we'll be talking about today. We've got a really interesting panel of artists and arts managers and people who have a really interesting range of experiences as artists and practitioners. Before we get started, I want to do just a quick show of hands. How many people in the room would call themselves an arts manager? And how many of you would consider yourselves an artist? All right, and how many of you are both? Yeah, that's not an insignificant amount. And I feel like if we ask that same question 5 years from now, more people would have their hands up at that last question. Right? Like we're becoming, the lines are becoming blurred between artist and arts manager. Probably more easily for artists identifying as arts managers, and maybe arts managers would feel comfortable calling themselves artists. I think it's interesting. So, I am going to go down the line and have people introduce themselves. Maybe give us your name, your primary identifying professional feature, and we'll take it from there. I don't want to say title, because title is, it could be a title, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jiron-Murphy, and I'm the director here at Hamiltonian Gallery. And that, I suppose, would be my identity. When you said feature, I was like, and my identifying feature is my dimple. Also professional.
Hi, my name is Peter Winant, and I'm a member of a collective called Workingman Collective, and work with primarily with my colleague Tom Ashcraft, Janice Goodman, and then an array of many others, and then I am also the director of the School of Art at George Mason.
Hi, my name is Morgan West. I am a creative strategist, creative consultant, which is an umbrella term for like a million different things here in DC. And I'm also founder and director of a platform called A Creative DC. We work to shift perception of DC creative culture by reflecting the perspective of DC creative communities, creative economy, and those who sort of support both.
I'm Zac Willis. I guess I would call myself an artist first, and then a framer. I run a small frame shop out of my studio. I also just recently opened up with my studio partner a small gallery space within our studio called Centerfold Artist. So I'm doing a little bit of everything. So that's kind of where I'm at.
And I'm Carolina Mayorga, and I'm like same as Zac was saying, I'm a primary visual artist.
And I do a little bit of teaching. I teach at Capitol Hill Arts Workshop, children and adults, drawing and sculpture. And my work is all over the place. A little bit of photography, video, performance art installations, so not just one main field. I'm originally from Colombia, that's where my accent comes from. But I've been here in this country for almost 20 years and in this area for at least 15, 16.
Thanks. So I've got a set of questions and sort of themes that we'll be starting off with, and then we'll open up for some questions towards the end. And although if we get to something that's a really hot button issue where it seems like maybe turning to the audience will make some sense, I might reach out and ask for comments and questions too. So let's start. In preparing for this, I asked each of the panelists to sort of basically tell me a group of, give me 5 things that you wish arts managers knew, or what are some pressing issues that you feel like arts managers should know about working outside of traditional practices. And we had 4 that kind of came up as common things. So I'll start with the first one, which is knowing the nitty-gritty, getting down to the actual brass tacks of things from zoning and permitting to where the local hardware store is. So if each of you could maybe talk a little bit about that nitty-gritty and an experience that you've had in some of your projects where having someone who knew some sort of technical nuance that was really important to your work and why that was so important. And you don't necessarily have to go in a particular order, so.
I mean, I guess I will start. I mean, for MySpace, the background that I came with, I graduated with an architecture degree as my undergrad, and then I have an MFA as well. So basically, I install work, I know how to build. So that's the main sort of like really came in handy doing what I needed to do to make MySpace, because I knew how to run electrical, I knew how to build walls, I knew how to like pretty much do everything that was needed to make MySpace happen. So sort of I'm like the biggest asset to sort of what I was doing, which I know the zoning and permit laws, because I've already had to navigate some of that stuff through past experiences. So, you know, that, and then a lot of people come to me to ask questions. So I'm kind of like a good person to know, and that they, like Amanda, I've worked a lot with Hamiltonian, doing stuff with them. So you know, working with them it broadened my experience, and then working with them, I hope it broadened their experience as well. So I guess in a way I'm the biggest asset to what I needed to find to make the space. I just needed the space, which is the toughest part to get.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, building off of what you said, Zach, so much of what I see my role as is the person who knows what resources or like people or things that we need to sort of collect to be available to the artists that we work with. So I feel like I'm the aggregator. And I try to, I really like, you know, really invest in relationships with people and try to get to know what their strengths are, so that when I am met with an artist who is looking for something very specific, I know exactly who to call. And it's really nice because we do have a nice working relationship. And I think that the more that we work together, Zach and I, for example, I know that with Zach, I can always expect things to have a really high quality of workmanship, if it's a frame, and that the timeliness of the way things are going to get turned around is very quick. So I think we're on the same page in terms of the level of professionalism that we want. But then even something like, you know, Hamiltonian was approached by the DC Commission to participate in 5x5. Maybe we'll talk a little more about public art initiatives, but then we were working with artists who had absolutely no footing in the DC community whatsoever. And so we ended up trying to act as an ambassador for the entire city for a specific artist needs. So
No pressure.
yeah, right. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is you know, partly connected to what you said is the necessity for communication and trust, and also the ability for a manager or curator and the artist to sort of understand what each other's goals are. And so, you know, a good example and an difficult example. We were part of a project several years ago, and what we wanted to do was put birdhouses along 14th Street. And everything was going great, and we put the birdhouses up, and 2 days later found out that the Department of Sanitation kind of started to tear them down, and got a panicked call from our curator and said, you know, you're going to get fined $100,000. and it was you know, we ended up taking it down, but it was like the kind of thing where, you know, the understanding of who was going to do what and how, you know, and even what needed to be done. You know, it revealed that the ownership of trees in DC is partly public, partly private along 14th Street. So some of those trees are owned by businesses, some of them are owned by the government, and oddly, it's not the Department of Forestry, but there is one, but the Department of Sanitation takes care of it. Who would have known that, right?
Well, the problem is,
and who should have known? But maybe we should have been more abundantly clear about what our methodology was going to be, and maybe, you know, in the sort of the contract and all that, it was like, you know, we'll take it. So there's an example of, you know, another example was, you know, when you're going out of town or doing a project many years ago in Poland, and I wanted to make some chairs move around the floor. And we were trying to figure out the mechanism. So, you know, the curator was fabulous. We started going to, you know, all these different shops to look at motors. And finally, it was the curator who came up with the solution of going to the automotive store and finding windshield wiper motors, right? So we did these windshield, and they were perfect. They were absolutely perfect. So there's an example of, you know, listening to each other and the curator and, you know, and really the manager is having me trusting her and she having the resources and, you know, go around to these different shops, and I could look for different motors.
so being able to think that creatively on your feet like that. Morgan, you wear a lot of different hats, and I imagine like there's a different set of literal regulations for a lot of what you do. How do you keep it all clear in your brain, right? As you're sort of switching from one project to the next. Have you known?
So like when you asked that question, I was like, oh, what lens do I like look at this from? But you know, I think I really like what you said about communication, and I think a lot of it has to do with community. And I'm kind of always going to be coming at this from like a social media angle. Creative DC is primarily like a social media marketing vehicle for like what's going on in DC. And over the last year, we've grown to almost 38,000 social media followers, like hyper-local, hyper-engaged, and like the wealth of information that I get from being plugged into that is just sort of, I mean, it's like a little bit insane. And so it's really, but at the same time, I think so much, like, I almost feel like it's impossible to be a comprehensive set of anything. So it's impossible to be like a comprehensive set of information. So it's almost in terms of like no man is an island. And it can be hard sometimes when you're in the middle of a project to sort of take yourself away from the chalkboard and be able to be open to other input, to be trusting enough to ask those questions, right? But I think there's so many ways to build like actual, tangible, like pick up the phone and know your number to call you and ask you a question community. And then also sort of being, also in 2016, just sort of embracing the fact that we have all of these resources available to us to find answers on another level and beyond Google, right? But I mean, there's just so many ways to sort of reach out to people who are experts. So I think that, I think one of the really important roles of an arts manager or any sort of larger arts organization is making themselves accessible to have questions be directed their way. I think sometimes there could be like an intimidation level with asking the questions, and so I think like anything that can be done to sort of have this open door, open window, whatever policies can be beneficial all around.
Intimidation on whose part? Like artists are afraid to ask arts managers, or?
I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get like philosophical necessarily, but like it is kind of like, I mean, simply asking a question. I mean, I always say like getting out of bed in the morning is hard sometimes, and like it can be hard to be like, I need help here. Yeah. Especially if you are someone who other people do look to as an expert. I think asking those questions is important, and it's brave, frankly, and it can inspire other people to ask for help as well.
Yeah, I think that's particularly true for artists. I find as an arts manager, I always appreciate it when an artist says, I'm struggling right here, I need help. And it's rare, actually. I'm surprised at how infrequent it is when an artist actually says, I need help finding a motor. Please, do you know where I can find a motor, right? There's something about that.
Like, for example, I have a couple of examples. I've done some public art projects with DC Commission, and some of the projects, like, they have totally, sometimes I say crazy regulations in terms of the permits, what size it has to be, what material, what's the safety issues, how, whatever is it gonna last, how many years, etc., etc. What's the weight limit of your whatever you don't have any idea when you're thinking of your own project. You just come up with this crazy thing and you think you're just gonna put it up, and no, you can't do that. You can't do this. So I end up basically working on those projects because the organization approaches me in terms of like, okay, I want you to do this type of work, and then these are the regulations, and then I come up with something that we can work with. Other than that, then it's just like a project that you have in your mind. But yeah, sometimes you're like, I don't think I can do this. Who am I going to ask to help me, accomplish this project? Who's the person that is going to ask the Department of Transportation if I can hang that up there and all that? Do I have to do it on myself? And they're probably going to say no. Because if you're an independent artist, they're probably not going to trust you very well. They need some sort of organization or something that says, yeah, this person is legitimate. You can let her do this thing. And so I think it'd be very helpful to have that kind of communication between institutions and how you can match the artist with the institution, rather than you have to do it yourself.
Right.
And then, or like I said, like I've been lucky to do some public art projects because the organizations have approached me. But if that's not the case, and they've provided, for example, I did some bike rack design. I just provided the design, and they fabricated it beautiful. They put it up in the streets, and they're still around. And then I didn't have anything to do with all the other things of contacting who's gonna build that for me. I don't have material. I don't have a welding shop, and so if you can find somebody in between that helps me with all the little things, that makes.
So having arts managers who really know the regulations and exactly like understanding the public art process and saying, okay, I can help an artist here by figuring out that, A to, it'll probably be X or Y, maybe even Z regulations that art project has to go through, and translate that back to the artist, right? So that the artist can focus on the art project.
A lot of times we want to do things that haven't been done,
Yeah.
right? I mean, everybody understands I want to build 100 feet of driveway, right? That's a no-brainer, or I want to put plumbing in here. But when you want to bring a dump truck onto the top of the building and then, dump 50 tons of asphalt back, it's like, what? What are we doing here? What are we? And so, it's like, it's not just, what we do, but we're coming at it from such an completely unknown.
Yeah.
And so we're all trying to do something to some extent that's bigger than us, right? And how do we do that? Well, not by ourselves, not alone, right?
So a question that's sort of related to this, and then we'll move on to the next topic, but in terms of the nitty-gritty and the knowing of the details, or the trying to figure out what's going to fly and not fly, where do you draw the line? And I guess to a certain extent, when do you pull in the arts managers to sort of be the person who should know, to make sure that what you're doing is sort of in line with what's supposed to happen? And when do you say, we're going to ask for forgiveness instead of permission in order to make my art what it is, right? Like at what point do you say, you know what, I know that they're not going to like that we do X, but I'm going to pretend, where do you, as artists, where do you say, I'm not going to, I kind of want to keep this little detail to myself because I know they're going to say no. And the arts manager is going to feel incumbent to say they can't do it. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's a tough question, but
Sometimes, you end up submitting a proposal that is really vague. Some things, but I'm not going to tell you exactly what before you approve it. Then, once you approve it, forget it. I'm doing it. So you end up being a little sneaky about it, and sometimes you just go get real stuff and do it. They catch you, okay, then I did it already. So, yeah, sorry, I'm gonna take it down. But sometimes you don't wanna do that, because you wanna, you want a project that you wanna show the community, you wanna be legit. It's not like it's fun to just kind of like make it happen. I mean, sometimes it can be fun, but at some point you wanna make it work and do it right. And so that's when you're like, okay, no, it can happen.
Amanda, have you ever had a situation where an artist has come to you and you're like, I'm not hearing this? It's really tiny spot.
No, it's okay. I mean, I used to work in a museum environment, and then I came to Hamiltonian, and this is definitely much more of like an artist collaborative type of environment. And I think all of the staff, and including myself, want to realize the wildest thing that an artist could possibly do. But yes, that is inevitably going to push up against things that could be against the rules. And if there's anything I can say about working with artists so far that I can tell, and like tell me if I'm wrong, it's that like if you set a rule, they're going to find a way to sort of bend it. And that's the fun of working with artists, but it can also be incredibly difficult. And I think that really for me, I've just had to learn how to be open and listen and really consider like, maybe I can bend this old like self-imposed rule. Gosh, any number of things. I mean, the first person that comes to mind, I love her dearly, and she makes great work, is an artist named Naoko Wasugi. She did this fantastic show called Assignment Happy Birthday here last January, where basically her students made the work. It was great, conceptually, like so many interesting lines the boundaries were blurred. I found the experience of working with her really illuminating. But there were a lot of things where I had to kind of like change my rules. Give access to the space at times that I may not have felt comfortable with. And thankfully, the building's still here, everything worked out, it was totally worth it. And like that's expanded my willingness to take risks with other artists in turn, so yeah.
I call it the no one's in jail, no one's in the hospital.
Yeah, there you go. But to that end though, one thing that I will say is that as a leader, I am prepared to take the brunt of the hardest stuff when it happens, and it does happen. And that's you're gonna have to learn how to negotiate with the artist and know when you can bend your rules. But then sometimes, frankly, shit goes down, and you've got to be the point where you're like, all right, the buck does stop with me, and I'll take it. And that's a big responsibility.
I want to move on to our next question. Sure. That's good. So one of the other things that came up a lot in all of your comments was this idea of really clear and targeted career support, and whether that's helping with putting together proposals, or Zach, I think it was you who said that having arts management students, even when they're in a program, scouting out spaces for artists and really like knowing the scene from the start so that they can share that with artists as a way of kind of expanding their potential venues and projects. So maybe you guys could all talk about where arts managers can help you with that sort of career and project support that isn't necessarily about regulations, but is sort of softer and more about connection.
I think it was really stemming from like our studios were in a hallway that was adjacent to the arts management program, and like I felt like I only passed them going to the restroom or haphazardly in the hall. Like we never had any like working relationship while in school, and like I felt like that was like a big disconnect. And even though we might be like locked away in our studios 99% of the time, we're always looking for places to like put our work and like show our work and even like talk to new people. Because you guys are learning, like arts management people are learning different things than what we're learning, and sort of understanding about the other side of the art world, where we're just like creating and like in our own heads and in our own worlds, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna sell, this is gonna be like the next $1 million painting, no big deal. I'm gonna be able to make this, but we need like that interaction with each other. And I even said this where I don't even actually know, I was trying to count how many arts management people I know now. And like when we asked if everybody, and I feel like everybody just sort of is like an artist and turned into like an arts management person that I've worked with. I mean, and that's not to say that I don't know arts management people that have that degree, but it's hard to like I don't know anyone. And I just wonder where you guys go, what you guys are selling the artists, or is there a website I can like ask questions on, or that sort of thing.
Use the hashtag #CreativeDC
There
all
we
the
go.
time. Yeah.
Is there not sort of an inherent oxymoron implicit in the term arts management? I mean, and isn't that like maybe a wonderful place to exploit the in that tension to sort of exploit the potential for what an arts manager is all about. And a crazy idea is like should an arts manager only spend 20% of their time in an office, right? And the other 80% walk in the neighborhood, or going down and finding out like. So what buildings are being slated for demolition, right? What that kind of stuff.
We're gonna come back to that for sure.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's an arts managers wouldn't be arts managers if they weren't really interested in the creative process.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And to a certain extent, be participants in the subversive nature of art. And that's, I mean, aren't we supposed to be sort of, while we're being incredibly positive and supportive and wanting the world to grow well, aren't we really at the same time being a little subversive? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, I would agree. That's what attracts me to artists in general as well. But I also think that, it's weird. I guess I see myself as part of the creative process. I hope that that's what artists are trusting me to participate in when they want to work with me. And so by doing that, I'm hand in hand going with them and being like, okay, let's make this weird, cool thing happen. And we may have to bend some rules in the process, and we're trusting each other to make that happen.
It's kind of like I'm having some revelations over here, because this is kind of like a new conversation for me. So it took me a really long time to be comfortable with calling myself an artist, and I kind of never, again, I'm a creative consultant, but I make a living basically being a freelance artist in the sense that I tell people how to message and communicate through visuals, and I create those visuals oftentimes, and I'm sort of sitting here thinking well, I don't necessarily have experience in the fine art world. I have friends who very much work in that world and who do these sorts of things, and for me, I sort of had to make my career up out of nothing. I started being a blogger, and then I was doing large-scale art installations for events, right? But that was me doing decor, I wasn't a site-specific artist or anything. And so all along the way, I sort of found myself having to look to other more established sectors for models on how my career should be built, right? So I look at the food industry a lot, and I see how DC small batch food companies or DC-based fast casual companies are growing, and okay, this is what they do when they get investment, and this is sort of how they spend that money, and this is who they're hiring, and how can I do that myself, or how can I do that with 2 interns, and figure out how to make their success something that is translatable for me. And so I'm kind of sitting here thinking wow, it's so amazing that someone whose art is not necessarily something that they're going to call a product or something that maybe fine art that is making the world a better place, but isn't necessarily set to sort of sell a commodity. That's amazing that there are people in school who are being trained to help them in their career. And I know you guys are probably duh, dummy, this is why you're here today. But I also think just to kind of sort of look back, I think just sort of being well-rounded and also sort of looking outside the scope of specifically arts is going to be really helpful. And so even just in terms of space, maybe thinking a real estate developer and stuff, or having connections with those people is going to be something that's really important.
Charlie, you said something about that idea of even just proposal support and then networking support.
Right, I think, like I was saying before, sometimes when you're by yourself, you're an independent artist, you're not as credible in a way. You're okay, I can show you my resume, I've been around for this. You have to build up your own persona and your image to sort of put together something that people think, okay, this can happen, right? But if you have some sort of support in terms of, okay, you're gonna write your proposal, but you have this organization or this art manager person, this person that is actually professional on this, backing you in a way that gives the whatever the institution that you're proposing this to, it gives them a little more credit, right? So it's like I'm not just crazy trying to do some work in your office or your building or whatever. I have this person that has this background, that is professional on doing this, that is believing in me. So it's kind of like creating that bridge that sometimes is so hard, you know, when you're, I guess all of us, you guys are visual artists, you know how hard it is to get into a show, to work in a public art project. Everything takes a long time, nobody pays attention, they receive 25,000 proposals and they put yours away. You get turned down 80% of the time that you send something. So it gets frustrating, you know, for an artist, and sometimes people end up like, doing other things or changing their careers because it's just too hard, you know. So if you find, like you were saying, the art manager, whoa, what are they doing? How, you were saying, we just cross, we just run into each other on the hallway. We need to start talking to each other more, and I guess have more like a relationship, because we have organizations that are artist oriented, but sometimes they're I don't know, they become like too big in some way, and then like it's a little. It helps. Sometimes they have these workshops. Sometimes they have these activities. But you need sometimes more like a personal connection. Somebody, an arts manager that is interested in working with, I don't know, environmental art, for example. Or like, what Peter was saying before, like finding buildings, like let's work with buildings that are going to be demolished. So if they have some sort of idea of what they want in their own project, then you can pick some artists that you can work with. On a longer term, I would say, rather than, okay, let's just do this project and I forget who you are. You can find, you can find your little pets. 5, 6 artists that you want to work with and create some sort of bigger concept.
One of the things I'm hearing here is like that there's sort of the role of the arts manager has a large sort of potential for public face and the potential necessity to sort of deal with individuals, right? So somehow or other in the balance of it's you're working large and working small, and so when your initial question about like how does art manager serve, right, the artist is I guess the question is, how does the arts manager serve art writ large and the artist writ small? And I guess what we're hearing here is being sort of the necessity to be sort of an activist and a visionary, and then also a nurse. Yeah, exactly.
Paul, the owner of Hamiltonian, always tells me that I have to be partially a shrink. But it's true, like I feel like that I have to constantly wear all of those different hats. Like you have to be somebody, it depends on who you're talking to, of course, but like I'm advocating for the artists with larger organizations, perhaps, trying to get people that are the goal is always to serve the artist, always. But with another arts manager, I'm going to be speaking a certain way. With the artist, I'm going to be talking about other issues. So yeah, I think you have to be able to do all of those things.
So I'm going to switch topic just a little bit and talk about something that I think sometimes we shy away from, and I think particularly arts managers need to start talking about it more often with artists, and that's the money question. And how artists get paid and how much they get paid and how arts managers should kind of keep that in mind. And Zac and Morgan, I think I want to start with the two of you, because you both, as you said, you both have your hands on a lot of different things, and you're sort of economic philosophy is a little bit more holistic, I think, than we traditionally think of with artists. So maybe if you were to talk to a group of arts management students about the reality of the economics of artists or creatives in DC, what do you want them to know, right? What are the key takeaways in terms of, hey, remember I have to pay my bills too, you know?
Yes.
Yeah, see, people like to talk about it, but I kind of feel like we need to talk about it, it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I know for me, like, just in terms of like whenever I'm speaking with anyone and they're like, you know, I would love to quit my 9 to 5. I would love to, you know, drop these like 6 part-time jobs that I'm doing to sort of facilitate like what my creative passion is, you know, whether that's art, or whether that's your blog or like whatever. I mean, it is hard, you know, it's like me personally, like I love the city, I've chosen to live here, I've made like a very like distinct choice living here, and I know that it's expensive, and I know that like I need to make like a certain amount of money in order to pay, you know, X, Y, and Z, and then also like maybe I'd like to go to like a new restaurant every once in a while. So like I always tell everyone like you need to like work backwards from like how much money you need, and then from there you have to do this really horrible thing of like quantifying what like 1 minute of your life needs to bring in for you in terms of money. It's not an easy conversation to have. Pricing is like one of the hardest things, like one of the hardest conversations that I have. Like I talk all day long with like the, photographers or like illustrators, and like I don't know what I should be charging, but I know that like the Washington Post pays this for like, you know, for like a photography job, and like, you know, I you know, one really doesn't have anything to do with the other, and sometimes you just have to sort of take what people are paying, otherwise you're not gonna. It's just such a difficult conversation. I'm talking myself in circles here a little bit, but I think like at the end of the day, you need to, even if it's not for your art, like think about for admin, right? So like every job you take, every grant you get, there's going to be like a certain amount of admin involved. Like you need to know what your cost is to do admin, and then you need to advocate for yourself all day long, and then while you're sleeping, to be paid what that dollar amount is. And it's uncomfortable, and it's like not cute sometimes, but it like absolutely needs to be done. Because if you are devaluing yourself, you're also devaluing the next 15 people in line behind you who are trying to get those jobs and get paid for what is really validly, culturally important work.
You pretty much. I mean, other than me actually quitting my 9 to 5 to be an artist and do this, but now I wake up I work more hours now than I ever did before. I mean, I was working up until this lecture. You know, so like you said, every minute of every day is spent like how to break it all down and how to like find where you need to be. I was working 9 to 5 and all the extra jobs, so that. And it gets overwhelming where you're just like...
Once you're out of your 20s, you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, you just start getting snowed over, and then before you know it, you're not making art, you're not going to openings, which I feel like is the biggest struggle of mine, is like trying to be out and be active in the community, but then still be a part of it, and you know, that sort of thing. But you know, you have to find a way to survive, so you got to balance all this stuff, and I think that's the hardest part. Is, you know, networking is just as much as important as like putting food on the table if you want to stay in sort of this like art world kind of thing and stay within.
And so is reading a book.
And so is reading a book, you know.
Just value all of your time.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And you know, and my parents always are like, why don't you just move back to Missouri? That's where I'm from. Move back to Missouri. It's a lot cheaper. It's a lot cheaper. But you know, there's not the same thing. The same things aren't provided there. So you know, like you said, you chose to live here for a specific reason, and that's why I stay here. And so I do what I can to get where I need to be, and then to get those extra things. That's where you got to go that extra little bit. Which sometimes, you know, is that 5-day in a row workathon. But
or taking a job that you're never going to put on your website or your Instagram.
Yeah, exactly.
But
you to sell your souls just a little bit.
so you can still sleep at night. You still need to sleep at night. But that's,
Exactly.
There's always sacrifices you have to make. I mean, I think I've been lucky enough to be able to be a visual artist for this long. You know, it's hard. Like people end up taking more than half of the classmates that I had in undergrad school in Colombia and graduate school here in the US, they're doing something else. They're not visual artists anymore, or they're doing some sort of related work. I work at a museum, or I teach sometimes. Teaching at I used to teach at colleges, and that was really nice. It just takes much more of your energy and all that, so you can't focus so much on your art. Yeah, if you come home at 9 p.m. or tired, who's gonna want to do like art? You don't even want to think about that anymore. So it's not, but it takes sacrifices when you make that decision. And going back to the pricing idea that Plato was asking first, there's creative ways to, you know, you always want the fat check. Who doesn't, right? Like, yeah, my work, I charge this an hour. I mean, let's be realistic with visual artists. It's not the most important thing in the world. What are we gonna do? It's a career that is not a money-making one. You know that from the beginning. If you chose to be a visual artist, you're not gonna, well, sometimes there's a few people that make tons of money, but it's not exactly a money-making career. So you gotta become creative in ways of how you make your money, how you get it funded for projects. Arts managers can be really helpful at that. For example, why don't we put up an art sale with a bunch of artists and then to support this project? Things like that. Sometimes, like my work doesn't actually sell, because when I do video performance and all these things, I'm not like a money-making, you know, art. I don't make any money out of my art, but some way I manage to get by. And then, like whenever I put a little drawing or a photograph, something in a setting where people are trying to buy, it sells. So it's like sometimes it's just finding those right connections. If I go say, hey, come to my studio that I have a bunch of art for sale, nobody's gonna come. I know that maybe if I say, yeah, there's lots of wine, and you kind of like sweeten the deal, but that's never a good. But if there's like a community of, you know, like an art manager that can help do those connections. You know, I have people that are interested. And you guys were right. I mean, we chose, I don't know if all of us chose to be in this area, but it's very interesting in terms of the arts. There's people with lots of money in this town willing to spend on arts. We just need to find them. And they'll come, they show up sometimes, but they should be more, pull more into the whole thing. People are willing to support our projects if they see their name up this big.
I see Peter shaking his head.
I'm shaking my head.
And you're also, through Workingman Collective, you're represented. Are any of you other represented by a specific gallery? No, like, so Peter's the only one with the traditional sort of.
Yeah,
gallery
and we're the chair of the case.
system. Yeah.
We're definitely the chair of the case. So I knew an electrician a while ago named Paul Scuderi, and this is back in my contracting days. And Paul had this great thing. He said, there are people in this world who want to live well, but they don't want you to live well. And I think that there is a real perception problem, and it's a genuine about the role of the artist and the undervalue, the devalue. When there's a charity, auction, hey, can you give your work to this auction for nothing? And then people who can come in and buy the work, and they can certainly afford to pay a full price. But right? So there's aspects of this that I think that we really need to, and arts managers, artists and arts managers, obviously resources are limited. People are going to buy food before they're going to buy art, and they're going to take care of. So I think that's something that maybe we ought to take a look at.
This idea that there's the myth of the starving artist.
The myth of the starving artist.
It is in fact a myth, because people figure out a way to not be starving, right?
Yeah, it may not be the idea, it may not be exactly what you want, but we're doing okay. I want to also there's a study that's being done, that's the SNAP study, right?
Yeah.
That I think arts managers might really want to pay attention to. It's SNAAP, And it's being conducted by Vanderbilt University and Indiana University. And it's looking at people who have been educated through the arts, and that's performing and visual arts, and then taking 5, 10, and 15-year view of where those graduates are now. It's an amazing resource of information about the jobs they hold, the debt they carry, right? Where the jobs are, where they're not, where they live, and so I commend that study to you.
Wow, there's so many things to cover with this question. So I guess we're building off of what you just said, Peter. Hamiltonian as a program was designed so that visual artists, once they got out of an MFA program or even just a BFA, would continue to make work. But it's making work and finding a place in the real world. And so I've been here now for 3 years. And actually, my husband is an artist, so I understand firsthand what it's like to have to juggle multiple jobs. I had to do that actually for a while before I even came to Hamiltonian, and I think that arts administrators often do wear multiple hats. You might curate on the side, you might do art criticism, you might have your own creative practice, and then you're also going to have your 9 to 5. In some ways, you should know this. Chances are your life is going to parallel very much that of an artist if you choose to stay in this field. Like there's going to be in some ways, some very little distinction between you and the way that you view your career and the way that artists view their careers too. So that's can actually be really helpful. But I think being very sensitive to having to go back and forth between both worlds, especially as the gallery director, because here I am supposedly representing the money.
Yeah.
And it's not true. It is and it's not, because I think that I understand what an artist has to go through to make the work that they want to make. I'm hoping that we can attract the likes of these moneyed collectors who want to invest in their work. But I also understand that that's not really, selling a whole bunch of work is never necessarily the end goal, especially with the artists that I'm working with currently at this stage in their career, very early on. So, for example, an opportunity to be in an art auction, I think is there's a small window where that may be of value to an artist, and after a while it's not serving them anymore. And so just really understanding that an artist's career is obviously it changes over the course of time. Selling something at half price, you shouldn't undersell your work, I agree. But it's finding that sweet spot between this is a steal, but I'm also serving myself and my artwork when I price it at a certain price point for an auction. And then now it's time for me to move on and maybe not offer that kind of work to an auction anymore. That's the kind of thing that I feel like artists, I hope, are comfortable enough coming to me and asking me about. And I'm going to give different recommendations for different people, all based on the individual. And then, just being able to advocate about the work to collectors and people, maybe not necessarily even in DC. And Hamiltonian takes its artists to Miami every year. That's like a kind of shock to the system sometimes for some of the artists that we work with, but it's good because it's just the hard and fast market. So some artists find that that's the type of environment that they thrive in, others not. No artist is created the same, and no art administrator is created the same either. So it's a very kind of fluid relationship that we have to have with that. And I don't know if any of the things I'm saying make sense, but I'm also thinking about value. There's monetary value, but then there's the intrinsic value of what you do. And I think that the reason that any of us get involved in any of this is because it has a much deeper intellectual, personal value to us than the money. The money is, and especially with the artists that I'm working with now, if we sell a piece, they're lucky if it's even going to break even for the cost of production. It's never about the sale. It's about everything that surrounds it. The intellectual contribution, the cultural contribution, and the relationships that they're able to forge by even just showing this work in this space.
So I have a question and sort of a follow-up to that, but also will transition into the next and the sort of last formal question that I have. And that's about sort of advocating for pay. And I'm thinking specifically of an organization called Wage, based out of New York. Has anyone heard of this group? Working Artists in the Greater Economy. It's a group that essentially is trying to have In the same way that performing arts organizations have to use union wages very often, or can't hire artists that aren't in unions, wage is dedicated to trying to get visual arts organizations to have a line item for artist payments in every nonprofit visual arts organization, so that in addition to paying, maybe helping them with installation, et cetera, they're also paying their artists. In the same way that performing arts organizations pay their performers, right? So the idea is it's the same thing, or it's an analogous thing. So I guess my question for you all is there a role in, even if we don't go as far as wage wants to go, is there a role for arts managers to advocate for artists always getting paid? Even if it's small, and like, I know it's a complicated question, but you know, the performing arts don't have a problem saying that artists need to get paid. Why? What about visual artists? And what is that? What might that look like? Would you want arts managers to be having that conversation on your behalf to their organizations, or to their, you know, if they're working on a project for you, you want them to go to the DC Commission and say, and the artist stipend is, or the artist payment is. Or does that scare you?
Well, no.
That's
Oh my
the
God,
decision
no.
person.
No,
Yeah.
not at
You
all.
guys, you pay
Artists-
artists here. They get
Yeah,
a
they all get a stipend. Yeah, and artists should always get paid. Bottom line. And I think that that's, you know, there's no question in my mind that needs to happen. And I'm totally comfortable doing that. I think that that's what arts manager, you have to be gutsy. Like, to do this work, you have to be brave and be willing to go there and advocate for the artists to get that, because it's, yeah, I think there's no question in my mind.
I think, so I mean, even just in terms of like baby steps, right? So like I think a huge portion of this, like as being an advocate, is actually being like an educator. It's like I'll talk to people all day long and be like, hey, like can you recommend me somebody who can like put a bunch of ideas together for X, Y, and Z? And I'm like, yeah, what's your budget? Like that's work. Like that is work. Or like, oh great, well do you have a referral fee for that? Because like working up to a place where you have like the amount of knowledge to be able to answer that question, that's work. But you can't do it in a way that's like rude because then they don't want to give you any money. So I think what it becomes is just deciding that you are in an industry where it is your responsibility to constantly educate like the general population that like this is work and like this is important work and this is necessary work and this is like culturally vital and like you actually need to find a little bit of budget for that. And maybe you don't have a lot now, but like this is something you need to keep in mind that like as you're scaling your business or as you're growing this project, like you need to be able to find money for this. Because the amount of times I work for free, I would be embarrassed to tell you how many things I did for free last year, but I know that I'm not alone in that. But I think it's just about, and especially in DC, I think it's just there needs to be a cultural shift of like, this is work and people need to get paid for it.
And also that idea of like educating people as to the value of art is a really interesting stance for an arts manager to have as well. To be able to say to somebody who may not have a background in the visual arts and may not understand, not even visual art, any type of art, this is why art matters in our culture. And this is why you should pay an artist to produce what they do. I'm totally a strong believer in that. And I do think it comes down to being able to empathize with what an artist has to go through to make the work they do, but then also be able to speak to people who may not have that type of background at all. Or maybe just, it's a way of negotiating. I think we almost have to negotiate a little bit and know how to speak to people on where they are about what it is that you're passionate about as an arts manager.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a sort of an interesting condition that will evolve, and that is evolving. And it's sort of a little bit tangential, but I think it's to the heart of what you're asking about pay. There's an astounding number of MFAs that are being generated each year in the United States, and there's not going to be room for everyone. And that's a pretty cold fact, but I believe it is a fact. And to a certain extent, the role, the sort of nexus of curatorial work, the aspirations of the artists and the arts managers, the recognition of arts managers of the niche that they're occupying, and the necessity maybe of exercising tough love, it's there, that's really there. Not everybody that says they're an artist really, sometimes maybe they don't all deserve support, right? I mean, I'm being a jerk by saying this, but I think it's true. And so, hey, yeah, I mean, I totally stick by my guns, with the Paul Scuderi thing, people, and yes, we ought to be considered as equals in terms of the value of what we do. It may not be as tangible as buying a 2x4, but what we do with the 2x4, wow. So I'm totally sticking by my guns, but I think that in a forum like this, I think we have to really address the other thing that's there, and really this is an ethical question that education really has to face, but it's also it filters into the whole support network of how the arts are approached by culture, by the politicians, by the people with money, and then the people themselves who are engaged in trying to promote something extraordinary.
Yeah,
right?
right.
So I'm just going to just see if Zach wanted to
Yeah, please.
sit on this.
I mean, generally speaking, if someone asks me to do something for free, I come back with $10 more an hour. I mean, just because if they have the willing to ask me for free, then they obviously are ballsy enough to know that the response is probably going to be like no, and either you're going to pay for my help and you're going to get me 100%, or you're going to have to find somebody else that's willing to do it. And it's really tough to be like, I just turned away potentially job and money and food and that sort of weird, like we were talking about earlier, where it's at, but then chances are 2 other things pop up because people respect you if you don't sell yourself short, basically. So, which I've learned that in the past, from my experience doing the framing business and working with all kinds of clients, different DC collectors, people across the country, just artists, even myself, other fellow artists, and everybody thinking that they can get a little piece of you for less, and you're just like, well, would you ask for less money for your art, or would you ask for less money to do that job, or that sort of thing. So you kind of have to be a little bit courteous, but at the same time, I stick to my guns that if you're gonna come that aggressive to ask for it for free, then I'm gonna come back and you're gonna have to pay more now. Which may not be the best practice, but it also allows me to kind of let me have the ball in my court.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really empowering, an important empowerment tool that artists should exercise.
I also think I come back to what Mayorga was saying about the education of the audience. There's for some reason the visual arts are not at the same level. You were saying performing arts. Who's gonna ask a performing group to go perform for free? Nobody does that.
Oh, they do.
Nobody else does
A
that.
lot of people do that.
A lot of people
Often.
all the time. We might not know what goes behind your work too, but it's usually the visual arts people assume that you. Sometimes I get asked the question what do you do? And I'm like, I'm a visual artist, and then they ask again, no, seriously, I'm a visual artist. So people still have that stigma or that stereotype kind of thing that visual artists, you're just having fun painting in your studio. I sit there with my brush all day and have fun. And then what? This is, of course, I have fun because that's what I chose to do. But yeah, it's a career. I'm a professional artist. And part of the problem, I think it comes from an educated audience, but it also, visual artists sometimes, I think we're guilty of that stereotype a little bit. There's a lot of bad art around. And then people get confused, They just see that somebody that is not educated, people that don't go to museums, don't go to galleries, I'm gonna buy art, or look at this funny thing, I want it. It just looks, right? And so people don't understand. It's also because sometimes visual artists, you're right, Peter was saying, you gotta not every art that you see, not every artists are good, you know. There's actually more bad than good ones. So, yeah, there's plenty of bad art around, and so people get confused, you know, with like who's a real artist, who's really on, you know, the long run for this, or yeah, you know so many artists that one day they're visual artists and the next day they're accountants. You're like, what? I just switched and then you appear, or I became something else just out of the blue, you know, like you're like, okay, yeah, you can do your second job, but you're still an artist or not. So it's confusing for the audience, and because we sometimes don't give the right image. We don't stick with our career as being professional. Sometimes we take it, yeah, like it's my hobby. And
That's why I think it's really interesting that I think that across the board, there's that you all sort of identify as sort of a collective title, right? Like Zach, you call yourself an artist, but you don't. We were talking earlier. You don't separate your framing practice from your art practice, right? They're like it's one and the same. And I think that's a really important and identity, because that cuts down on the confusion of, is he a framer or is he an artist? No, he's an artist, and you know part of his skill set is framing, right? And I think that's right, that there is something to, there's a strength in having that sort of broader title, and also educating the community about that, right? And that you have to pick one or the other.
How many of you are familiar with Eddie Rama? Okay, Eddie Rama is an Albanian artist, and Eddie ran for mayor of Tirana and got elected, right? So here's this guy. It's like he's a painter by his training, and now he's the mayor of Tirana, Albania, at a time when the city was just like, So he came in, and not everybody loved him, but he was part of absolutely transforming the city. So he went in, things were repainted, there were murals, there were all these kinds of projects that began to happen. So I'm asking a question here, so what happens if one of you become mayor? Right? Are you still an arts manager? You probably are. Right? What happens if you become, go into the House of Representatives and actually start making laws that, are you still an arts manager? Probably so, right? All these lines are just totally blurred now. Absolutely blurred. And I think that's actually, it's a really wonderful condition.
And actually, that actually transitions perfectly to the last question that I wanted to ask, which is about that sort of that civic engagement and that advocacy, right? And the fact that artists can identify an artist and still be, they can be parents, they can be taxpayers, they can be framers, they can be, there's the title might be artist, but they are all these other things that intersect, right? All these other worlds that intersect. And I know myself as an arts manager I find myself increasingly now encouraging artists to identify as those other things as well as just being an artist, because it reminds people that they're actually all part of the same community. So I wonder if you guys might talk a little bit about, what is the role of the arts manager in sort of broadening the understanding of the idea of an artist beyond just the creative individual, but also the taxpayer, the PTA parent, the community activist, what's the value in that, and particularly as we see in this city, the city changing so much, and how might that sort of standing up and being visible as both an artist and taxpayer, however that resonates with you all?
I think we're just in, it's such a tough question, and one person that immediately comes to mind is Victoria, the Transformer. She's someone who has this, she's incredibly politically educated, politically engaged, and she's somebody who is I saw a picture of her on Instagram. She had chased Mayor Bowser down the street because she saw her walking past, and she wanted to make sure she used that opportunity to speak with her about arts initiatives in DC. And I think that this is such an interesting city, you know, I mean, like, population size, like, square mileage, you know, I mean, like, it can be really frustrating to feel like the city isn't necessarily serving you, or like the country at large isn't necessarily serving you when you find yourself like walking or driving past the White House a couple times a week, or like, you know, you feel like you should be so close that you should be able to sort of like affect change and make things better. And I think that, you know, DC is a place where it's easy to get burnt out and it's easy to feel like there's not enough here for you. And I think that if you want to complain about that, that's one thing, and that's probably not really good for your psyche. But if you want things to like actually change, I think you kind of need to look at like who can be an agent of change. And it's either like aligning yourself with someone who already has a voice or something to leverage, or it's about becoming that person yourself. And that's scary, but art is scary, so this like shouldn't really be like new to anyone who's like involved already. But I don't know, it's interesting, and it's something that like personally I've been thinking a lot about, because last year we grew an enormous audience, frankly, on social media for Creative DC, and at the end of last year I really thought like, I've been spending this entire year, my team and I have been spending this entire year taking in perspective and like listening to people's needs. So like what's our responsibility? Like we have a voice that we can leverage, so like how are we gonna start using that in a way that like helps make the city better for the people who are already making the city better? So for me, this is a time when I'm just noticing, maybe for the first time, maybe that's naive, but like how many of my friends who are engaged in the arts are politically active. And politically active doesn't mean, I mean, it can sometimes just mean voting, or like being aware of like who's going to be looking out for your interests, like who's in office. Yeah, that's my like rambling little answer for that, but I think it's just really, it behooves you in DC to sort of pay a little bit of attention to that and engage where possible.
I think by our very nature of being human, we're all multifaceted. And then I think that as arts managers, it's easy for us to see ourselves in like a specific kind of box, but everybody has something else they bring to the table. And I think that as you progress in your careers professionally, you'll start to realize like, oh, I'm a really good public speaker. I'm a really good writer. I have this skill. How can I use it? How can I, it's just a question of developing and honing those skills within yourself, I think. And then, yeah, using it for the greater good. Like if we were all political activists, it's necessary, granted, but there are other things that you bring to the table as well. And we don't all have to be the same. We should not be the same. I think that that's one wonderful thing. I just got to plug the staff at Hamiltonian, because everybody comes to the table with a variety of skills. And no one person should have to wear all of the hats. We all contribute.
I mean, I'm just thinking like the best way that arts management, like someone can help me, and that, because I sometimes get so focused in the studio and work and everything that you lose sight of what's out and about in the real world. And I think that that's where you guys really play like a huge role, like coming in and, you know, even if just, you know, like if you're working with an artist, like checking in on them, making sure that they're not like so knee deep in their own mind that they're losing perspective on the project. And, you know, you were talking about being vague on like your proposals, but then understanding the person working with you, the curator or whatever, understanding that you're going to provide something that's going to be great, but then still them checking in on you to make sure that you're still like staying focused. I think that that's like one of the biggest things that has helped me working with curators in the past. Is they're kind of the grounding source of my like dreams, and like kind of like keeping me from like floating too far away from reality. So, you know, I rely heavily on the curators and people that I work with when I do shows to help kind of like direct my vision to something that's like not so extreme that it won't, like the public and the audience won't like take it in, but, you know, it just sort of like can be this vision that I can still show, but not so far gone that no one can like touch base with reality to it.
I think it's important, you know, I was talking about compromises before, you know, how far you need to go, right? That's kind of like a balance that you need to find when you're a visual artist. And that the art manager, I think, can help with that, like if you have some sort of, okay, you can't go this crazy because, the budget is not as big as you want it. Of course, you always want to do the biggest project, but you have to come back to reality, and these are the conditions, these are the permits that you need, these are the things that they're offering, and are you willing to work with that or not? Sometimes I turn down, nice commissions, but if they don't like, for example, change the concept, I'm like, no. I can't go that far. Change the size, okay. Don't show 5, show 3. I can do that. Or make it smaller. I can do that. But the whole concept in the first place that you're asking me to change the whole piece. Then so I'm not interested in working with that. And then I lost 3 months working with this person, trying to figure it out, and it didn't work. If you have somebody that can help you with all that, like, okay, don't even apply to that because you know what, that's not what your work is about. And I was, you mentioned Victoria Reese, I had some project that I wanted to do, and then I was working with this organization for like 3 months, trying to put together a project, and it finally fell apart. And I was talking to Victoria one of the days, I was just telling her about this, and she says something that I was really surprised because I never hear. She was, this is important. I had no idea. Thanks for telling me that this is going on. We should do something about this. I'm like, really? Are we gonna do something about this? Because sometimes you're just used to, you learn. Exactly, you're like, oh, okay, so this didn't work and whatever. Nobody knows.
So there is something about having an arts manager be the advocate for that.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's also a way that arts managers can sort of be the conduit for, here's some policy that's coming down that you guys need to know about, or can arts managers maybe find unlikely alliances for artists, right? Like people that you wouldn't ever think of, working with, that people should work with. Like an example that I'd like to look at is the Minnesota Culture, Arts and Culture District wanted to get a % for art tax, and they partnered with the hunting lobby because it was both under the same, like the park system and the art system were together, and so the hunters wanted to like go out and shoot things, and they wanted extra money for like to keep the parks pristine. And the artists were like, well, we'll join hands with you for this one project because it'll mean millions of extra dollars in tax dollars that can go to art projects. So it was like a really strange bedfellows thing, but it was an arts manager who realized, like technically in the budget, the people that wouldn't necessarily be your allies are your allies. Is there a role for that here where someone's like, you should be, you might consider talking to the Chamber of Commerce even more, right? Like, is there value in that? Would artists be willing to do that? Or is that like, no, I'm not talking to people who are,
I would say yes, just because, if I'm an artist, chances are me walking into like the Chamber of Commerce and like striking up a conversation like, hey, do you have a project? Here's my portfolio. Like, it doesn't feels weird to like approach it that way. So if there was that gallerist or that curator or however that role needs to be filled, that sort of is the in-between that bridges the gap. I mean, that
reminds the Chamber of Commerce that you're a small business.
Exactly.
And that's what they're there for, right?
It's also, a lot of the artists I know barely get out of their house. I mean, I'm slowly becoming more of a homebody myself, where I just like being at home. I like being in my studio. I don't want to talk to people necessarily as much. Or even it's not even talking to people. It's like putting yourself out there, waiting for that like rejection. Whereas like if something was to happen where it was more of a conversation and not so much like a face-to-face with the artist, it's like here's some projects that is coming down the pipe. Would you be interested in these? As opposed to like, hi, I'm Zach, I'm here, I'm an artist, look at me. It would be beneficial.
Claire, is there like a sort of an organization of Washington arts managers? I mean, how do you all get your information?
American for the Art.
What's that?
Yeah, Emerging Arts Leaders.
American for the Art.
So there is sort of like a warehouse.
Yeah, but it's like, yeah.
Because here's where I'm going with this, is that, DC is pretty good size. It's not like New York, right? But we got to look at the number of museums, arts organizations, galleries, right? Units and subunits, and are you guys talking to each other, right? Do you all know, like, well, I had this thing happen, right? And I was like, I had this incredible, we thought we were great, and then this Department of Sanitation showed up. Right? Or I had this artist who was like, had this amazing idea and we just couldn't get it, or we could get it through because of X, Y, and Z. Because it sounds to me like there's that the real barrier that's here, that's one of the significant barriers that's here, is the communication barrier. Like it's the identification of resources, and those resources can be monetary, they can be organizational, they can be civic, they can be, and how do you all learn about each other and about us? And that's the thing that I think is and that's that's why we're here and talking about it. But a simple thing like this,
Exactly.
There is an NASAA in DC, actually, the national, with really also an agency. There is a lot of agency that
It's that they're so big.
Big,
right?
yeah.
It's the one-on-one conversation that's tricky. I think this is actually a good time to open it up for questions, I think. Because I think we're at a good point where people are going to want to ask some questions about just this, right? Like, let's start the conversation. Because I think you're right that there is communication between part. Is there any sort of closing comments that you guys wanted to say before we opened it up for questions and with arts managers who are interested in?
Hi, my name's Jeremy. I'm an arts manager, and I'm someone who really likes the nitty-gritty of helping artists on a daily basis. I could have a career just doing that, and I think I'd be perfectly happy. But eventually, you do have to recognise the value of what you can do in an advocacy role. But oftentimes, we've talked about arts managers almost in an individual sense. But almost always they're part of bigger institutions that have broader programmatic intentions than just only helping the artist alone. So I'm wondering, and oftentimes the definition of what that value of art is mutable and changes and is not the same from institution to institution. So there's a great deal of commonality of purpose, but a kind of lack of cohesion in the way that people talk about art. So I'm wondering what institutions can do better on an institutional level with that question of advocacy.
Specifically around advocacy.
Yeah.
Institutions doing that.
So many, I think, and maybe I'm saying this because I'm an educator, but I think at the core of almost every museum, almost every, in a way, gallery or other arts outreach is the role of education. And that education is like multifaceted. It's not ever a single thing, but it's really about the potential of what art can do. And I on the one hand, we're all serving a common kind of goal, and that goal is it's a moving target. You know what I mean? The role of art is shifting. It's not getting smaller; it's getting broader, right? And it's getting deeper, I think, as well. So, and then there's this thing in our culture that it doesn't necessarily pit organizations and museums against each other, but it kind of does. Because in a like DC, there are a lot of really wonderful, very generous people who genuinely care about what art can do for all of us. But it's like I'm giving my money there, right? And I'm giving my money, and so I think that there's that sort of implicit sense of hierarchy and competition it creates barriers, and everybody is understandably sort of protective of what their territory is. Now, how that could be, unzipped, right, and how we can open doors, I don't know, but that, because I'm an artist. You guys are the managers, it's like figuring out, now how do I go about it? And maybe it goes like this question about like, well, is there an organization that where people can
Or I
talk?
wonder though if projects like Morgan's are sort of a response to that, right?
It is, and I actually, hi Jeremy. I actually really like the way that you phrased that and sort of where this question was coming from, because that's something that came to mind a few times over the last hour or so, is that, arts managers are generally linked to like an institution, right? So like, I appreciate that there are probably like freelance art managers, but I think for the most part, you're kind of hoping to like link up with someone larger. I think that, and I work with a lot of institutions. I do a lot of work with the DC Public Library Foundation, and a lot of work with like larger nonprofits who are doing really sort of like amazing things for the city. But I think what it ultimately comes down to is messaging, right? So it's like the opportunities that are available, the services that they provide, and in a larger sense, like this is DC government too. Like they have a lot of programs, a lot of stuff that is so beneficial for everyone. Everyone who's like contributing to the creative economy, right? There are all these workshops that you can take for free. There's all these things, and like I hate to boil it down to like, but nobody knows how to make it sound cool. But like nobody knows how to make it sound cool and make it sound appealing and let people know that these things are sort of like here for them. So I do feel, with the Creative DC again, kind of like with looking back at the audience we built, what is our responsibility to that audience? Like, there's DC is a city where like. I've been here 10 years, I've been in the area 35 years, and I'm like constantly discovering and rediscovering what the city is. And I think in terms of like institutions, and I think in terms of like what they offer to the arts specifically, again, it's just about knowing that the times have changed, and when you're a nonprofit or you're an organization, you've probably mapped your four corners a really, really long time ago, and those can feel immovable a lot, but I think there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of ways to be creative within the sort of parameters that have existed for a really long time, to be able to take into account, like, shoot, we really need to tell people about us, or like this organization is going to die because we're not going to be getting any money, or like all of our donors are over 50, like how are we going to reach people who are like 20, who can give us like $8 a month now, who like hopefully will be able to give us like $800 million a year, you know what I mean? So like, I think it's about re-examining the messaging and re-examining like what you have to offer, not just for like the base that you have now, but for all of the people who are kind of like, you're not yet reaching.
Hi, I'm Shruti Mukundan. I'm at the AU Arts Management Program, and multiple times in this conversation, I think, from what I understood, there was a blur between an artist agent or a representation of the artist versus the art manager who's at an organization facilitating things happening. And I think that's another thing that we should open doors for more conversation in terms of that versus what the artist expects of the person on the other side. And honestly, speaking for myself, I'm also an artist, and I've decided to become an art manager. And I know most of my class is very similar. They've had some sort of artistic training, and they've decided to become arts managers. So it's not that we've come from business school. We've been in the same kind of environment, and we're just learning the business side of how things work. So I don't think it's really like on either side of the thing. We're all, I think, kind of very intersectional, and there's lots of room for blur, vague expectations, but at the same time, stereotypes saying, oh, I'm the artist, you're the arts manager, so I don't know how we're going to come together. But I think it's making very clear that, look, I'm representing myself, so I don't know what your organization needs, so you would have to specify because I'm just the artist here and I have no clue. Or because that person might think you're representing yourself, so you already know this is what happens normally.
Just to kind of off the institutional component, there's so many artists that aren't even, and that's sort of the crux of why we came here today, is that so many artists are not working in institutions anymore, right? I mean, the Workingman Collective and Art Attack before that, not affiliated with an institution really. Carolina, that you don't really, like you'll partner temporarily with an organization. Zac, you work with Annette Isham a lot, but you don't have it's, so and I feel like I'm seeing that more and more. It's almost like maybe because organizations have mapped out their four corners so long ago, is there a moving away, are artists sort of moving away from that model altogether and just saying, you know what, forget it, we'll do it ourselves?
Basically, you were totally right. Like, there's not that part of a division between one and the other. You become, like, I feel like I became my own art manager. Without knowing it, without knowing, or studying or how to go about it, at some point you become your own art manager. I gotta go to the art shows, I gotta show my face, bring my cards, do all the networking myself, and then eventually I can ask somebody that knows somebody, can you introduce me to that person so we can have some sort of, so basically you do it on your own. It's much harder, you learn how to do it. I guess I can still do it for, as long as it takes because I'm already used to doing it. But if you have some sort of direction, and then you're totally right, like we shouldn't expect as artists, okay, you're just gonna send me all the shows you can and I'll see you in 3 months. Yeah, that would be great. But when you want it like, okay, I have this specific thing that I would like from you, or like, that I would like help with, for example, finding, how do I find somebody interested in funding this kind of project? Or do you know anybody, like more like connections and those kind of things, as opposed to, you guys can only do so much for artists, and you shouldn't have those like expectations, or that's how, things are gonna work out. Because it's usually, you have to do a lot on your own too, to help the art manager know exactly what you need, otherwise it's just too vague.
I hope that we, that our discussion hasn't given the impression that it's us against them, or that there's that I think that we've really been talking a lot about the necessity for collaboration and the blurring of lines. That who's the artist here, right? And that where's the art, right? And establishing it. One of the other things that I think is maybe it's sort of an abstract consideration, but I think it's maybe an important one is how we think of space, right? And because walls don't mean as much as they used to, right? And conceptual walls as well as actual physical walls. And so the idea of arts management, as well as the work of the artist, and all of it put together as this larger thing that's bigger than the sum of any one of us, right? That is occurring now in cyberspace, out in parking lots, and there's all this, there's a huge potential to explore, again, through collaboration that involves creativity and part of management. Good management is always highly creative, right? So how does that, how do we begin to kind of reshape our vision of this moving target of roles? We are all doing things differently than any of us did 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, we will be doing things, hopefully, very different than we are now. There will be some enduring things that we've held on to, hopefully, that are valuable. We've been able to, move on from the things that weren't. So.
Funny thing is that, I think that within the panel, I'm the closest thing that I can think of that comes to representing a brick and mortar institution. And I came from something that was an institution with a capital I, the Phillips Collection. There was a vision there. There was a very specific directive. There were things I could do, things I could not do. I had a very kind of restricted role there. And I don't know what will happen to all of you as individual art managers. Maybe you will go to a place that has a sort of a looser framework than what I started with. Mine was tight. And I realized it wasn't for me. And so I came to Hamiltonian, and this is a wonderful thing. There are specific parameters that I have to operate within, but then there's also a lot of creative freedom, and that really suited me. And I think that just, it boils down to each of you and what you want to contribute and where you shine best. So going back to Jeremy's question about how we define art and how mutable that is from institution to institution. What's been wonderful about working here is that I got to make that definition. And as I go along, it's changing with the artists that I work with. They're challenging me in the way that I envisioned what an institution was. So it's constantly evolving, but what's happening is that I think that a brand is starting to emerge. There's like a certain level of quality that gets associated with the space that I'm running. I think that you're doing the same thing with Creative DC. Each of us individually, I think, is doing that. Defining what it is that we're about, what we bring to the table, and then letting that be what guides us forward. And actually, I think that there should be a range. There should be a range of how we define what art is. And so I think we can all coexist within that. Now, it kind of comes back to the money question that we had earlier. Like, then are we all grasping for the same? And yeah, we are, but we're probably going to have to get more creative about the way that we think about fundraising and sustaining the things that we have visions for too. So there need to be multiple institutions. There shouldn't be just one definition. And I think that as you go as arts professionals, you'll figure out what it is that you believe to be the highest caliber of visual performing in any form of art and contribute that to the collective conversation.
Do you have time for one more question? Because they're dying to be drunk. This will be our last question.
Hi, I'm a student, and my friend sent me a question to give earlier. So this question is that after 7 years of programming, are you starting to gather data about this long-term impact of this fellowship? And what is the relationship like with the first round of this fellowship?
So this is about the Hamiltonian Fellowship?
Yeah.
Okay, actually that would probably be better suited to the person who runs the fellowship, because I work with the artists that are part of the fellowship, but I'm part of the commercial gallery side. And so yes, there is definitely data that we're trying to collect as we speak, but I would want to defer you to Nicole now, who is here. She's right there. She's working on the programming and fellowship side now, and also Rebecca Pineda. She's not here this evening, but she's starting to do fundraising for Hamiltonian, and so that's the type of data that is needed for us to be able to do fundraising.
Amanda, did you talk about, I might have missed it, the construct of Hamiltonian and like?
I didn't get into it, but I can. Would you like
I'm
to?
looking at Claire
Sure, I
now.
think people should give research, but go ahead.
Giving a simple overview, but Hamiltonian is a very interesting composition of entities to create an artist-centered organization. So I just think that's...
Yeah, it's an unusual model. Okay, I'll give the spiel. Paul So, who founded this space, is a professor of physics at Jiron-Murphy. And he also has a background in the arts. And he realized that there was something missing in what he saw as the artist education. I think he's very invested in young talent. And he said, well, you know, I went through a postdoc when I was getting my degree. And that was a really valuable time of experimentation and also learning the professional ins and outs and what to expect in my life as a scientist. And that doesn't exist for artists. And they need that, because the first thing that happens when an artist gets out into the real world is they lose their practice, because they've got to pay their bills, they've got to do the hustle, all this stuff. So he started up this program as a two-pronged organization. One is a 501c3, which is the fellowship program that you were asking about. And within that fellowship program, it's a competitive process to be admitted into this program. We have a panel of arts professionals, and that we've been able to define that actually, which has been really great. So anyone from a practicing artist who's been able to make a sustainable living doing that, to critics, curators, and people who are widely respected for being cultural contributors, really, or who choose the artists that end up participating in that fellowship program. That fellowship program, the artists that are part of that program are the artists that I represent on the gallery side. So the gallery is a profit-earning side. But I work very closely with the fellowship program. I feel like we're constantly going back and forth between how to coach and help the artists that we're working with, and then also get them a foothold in the market. So really my job as the gallery director is to do that, to help these artists find their place. Not all of them are necessarily going to be lending themselves to a strictly traditional commercial practice, like Mr. Rob Hackett here. He's probably going to be somebody who's going to be teaching and looking for grant money. That's okay, because the way that we define an artist is shifting and evolving. And so as arts professionals within the gallery or respective fellowship,
we're having to keep up with that as well to be able to sustain these artists.
All right. Oh, do we have time for one more, or do we want to do a little, I don't know, I'm looking for a citizen audience. Let's do one more very quick question, and then we're going to go, and I saw the hand back here.
So, my name is Lena. I'm also an artist turned arts manager. But I guess we touched on fundraising and development, and I landed in the development field of fundraising. If you asked me 5 years ago, do you want to do fundraising? I'd be like, God, no. But my understanding of it has shifted. So my question to you as artists or even arts managers, what is, because I feel like development is the same as arts management or as artists, is people have different reactions to it, or they may not fully understand what fundraising is, or they're like, oh, you ask people for money, right? That's what your job is. But it's, for me, the definition for development is relationship building and network, which can result in money or can result in resources. So for you, what would be most helpful in dealing with an arts manager in the development and fundraising role, I guess, as an artist or as an arts manager, kind of what's the most effective, what do you need? Besides like, oh, please get me money, I mean, that's hard for me to work with, but kind of how do you see that relationship being fruitful?
I mean, I like how this kind of circles back to your question, or to your statement, saying that, you know, like you're someone who like comes face to face with artists and understands like where they're coming from, but you're also on the other side sort of have an organization to whom you can like collect resources or like share that experience. So, you know, I think for every artist it's going to be different, but I mean, I think like developing those relationships on a personal level and then figuring out how to leverage those personal relationships and the information that you gather from those and leverage it into sort of like a larger conversation with people who do have money to sort of funnel into it. So I mean, I think ultimately, you know, being a communicator, being a conduit is like, you know, at the end of the day, probably what's best going to serve the individual artist, and then, you know, translating that into like the economics of, of however it needs to be translated to these larger works.
I'd say, you know, to do what you can to provide fertile ground for artists to plant seeds in.
It's a much better answer.
Yeah.
Both are great.
All right, well, any closing thoughts from the panelists? Anything that you're dying to make sure that arts managers know?
Thank you for everything you do.
Yeah. Thank you for everything you do. So hashtag #8GradedDC, make sure to follow it on various platforms. And thank you, Hamiltonian, for hosting. And thanks to all of you guys for being here.